Afternoon, Ji. Good afternoon, Assalamu alaikum. I'm Saima Mohsin. I'm a journalist, a British Pakistani, and someone who's incredibly pleased to be here in Lahore as part of LLF in person. I keep saying it every session I do, but it's just so great to be back in person and to be back, for me personally, in Pakistan after a very long time, after being injured on assignment. So a pleasure to be here and good to see people coming to this session, and I hope you're enjoying many of the other brilliant sessions that we have. The session, as you will know, because you're attending it, is called Pandemic, Doctor Stories from the Frontline, and I'm really pleased to be joined on my left by Special Assistant to the Prime Minister on Health, Dr. Faisal Sultan. Then there's Dr. Roopa Farooki, author of Everything is True, and Professor Saad Shafqat, author of The Rivals, all of whom have worked incredibly hard during the pandemic. Thank you. I'm going to ask everyone to make sure their mobile phones are on silent, and if you need to have a conversation, please do leave the room. And you know, we're really lucky to have these people with us, and I'm sure you want to afford them the time and respect to listen to what they have to say. I'm a really strict timekeeper, so I will keep time, everybody, to make sure that we can crack on and get as much information from them as possible. I'm going to introduce them briefly and launch into my questions. So, Dr. Roopa Farooki has actually had a couple of sessions here. I'm not sure if you've managed to listen to her, so we're going to try and mix it up and give you a good idea of what she's experienced personally and why she put pen to paper. In early 2020, as a junior doctor, Roopa Farooki lost her sister to cancer. But then just weeks later, she found herself in the middle of a once-in-a-lifetime crisis, a pandemic. And she was working in a hospital at the time, and Everything is True is based on her experience out of the first 40 days of COVID-19. But for me, it is so much more. It was full of strength, sadness, it's poignant, it's angry, it's a real look at life as probably we all experience it, both professionally and personally, from the extreme in natures of the crisis and life experience you had with your sister's passing, but also to the mundane of having to just do life's chores. Dr. Faisal Sultan is Special Assistant to the Prime Minister on National Health Services. In this capacity, he heads Pakistan's Ministry of National Health Services Regulations and Coordination. He's been an integral part, of course, of the National Command and Operations Centre. Those of you who live in Pakistan will be very familiar with him, and Pakistan's pandemic response under that. He's an infectious diseases physician, and he also sits now, most recently, on the board of Gavi, and that's the Global Alliance for Vaccine Equity. I almost said vaccine inequity, which is what we will be discussing later. And then to Professor Saad Shafqat. He is a professor of neurology at Aga Khan University Hospital in Karachi, and he's also written a novel, and it's slightly different. It's a drama involving sexual politics, leadership conflict, set in a hospital, and it is, of course, fiction, or is it? Is it based on somebody or your observations? And he, too, worked throughout the pandemic. So thanks very much indeed for being with us. I want to start with yourself, Dr. Sultan. Pakistan's pandemic response has been lauded amongst intergovernmental organizations globally. What was it that made Pakistan better than many other countries in the global north at responding? You know, so I heard there was a magic thing because obviously God is overseeing Pakistan, or is it because doctors like yourself have had these experiences of dealing with acute crises and health crises in the past, so you just knew what to do and how to respond?
Thank you. So, to be honest, nobody really knew how to respond everywhere. People thought they did, but when confronted with truly a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, a lot of systems that existed got stressed, and nobody really could figure out immediately as to what needed to be done. There had been preparations, there had been exercises, and there had been a lot of conversation on the next pandemic and what was to be done. But when it really hit, I think everybody found themselves lacking. In our case, the one thing I would say, there's a bunch of things, but the one thing that I would say is a calibrated response, which was coherent and based on information and scientific data, as opposed to hearsay and stuff that wasn't entirely scientific. We are a large country with a very heavily devolved federal health structure. And while it has its goods in the sense that the benefits are, of course, good local delivery of care, well, that's what the theory is, but the ability to then have and come back and be coherent in your response across 6 federating entities, 4 provinces and other units was the real challenge. And I think if you were to ask one thing, I would say a data-driven, coherent response from one central place and buying of credibility, earning of credibility.
I'm going to interrupt quickly because we did hear in many other countries, certainly the United Kingdom, that things were data-driven, but the response and the outcomes were unmatched.
So look, you can't really compare countries. They're very different in their structures, their needs, their responses, their population pyramids, social interconnectedness, densities of interconnectedness. So a number of things are really not comparable. But if you would look around, you'll find that the countries that struggled the most were large federal structure countries, USA, Brazil, India. What's common amongst them? Massive countries with devolved healthcare structures, one state or province not necessarily talking to the other or having different responses. So the ability to bring everybody in one room and say, look, here is the coordination mechanism, here is the expertise of various kinds, whether infection control or treatment or prevention or vaccines or this and that, and to use that as the platform of credibility that then was farmed out to the provinces. And so there was inherent initial disjointedness, there was inherent competitiveness almost adversarialism, but it all got harmonized into a response. The experts across various provincial entities were able, they either knew each other to begin with because it's a very small group of people, or credibility was earned both ways. And so once that happened, it was much better to manage. It was still hard, but that, I think if there is a secret sauce there, that was it. Thank you.
So Dr. Farooki, to you and your brilliant book, Everything is True, it's there. What I found that really struck, well, so many things struck me about your book, but one of the things I want to start with is to give people an understanding of the nature of your writing. It is a diary, it's of the first 40 days, and you pack a lot of dense information about what you're experiencing very, very succinctly. Is that the nature of the fact that it was a diary, the emotion and the experience that you came home with that you wanted to pour onto the paper? How did that evolve?
First of all, can you all hear me? No? Can you hear me now? No? Yeah, can I? All right. So, yeah, well, it's not a friendly book to read. I kind of appreciate that. And I think I didn't approach the right, I've written several, books of literary fiction, and those were crafted, and those were written thinking of, a possible reader in mind. And this book was not written in that way at all. It was more a kind of unspooling of experience. It was a way of me trying to make sense of what was happening to me every day on what people were calling the front line, and, what people were saying that, you are doctors, you are going out there, you're being heroes, you're being courageous. And in fact, we were just doing a job, and we didn't feel that we had very much options. And it wasn't about being fearless. Everyone was terrified about what was going on. It was a way of dealing with that. I'd like to say it was a kind of cathartic diary, except catharsis implies some level of healing. And in fact, it felt like almost re-scarring myself at the end of the day by having to live it again. But I started the account because I was afraid that I might forget otherwise. I was afraid that with distance you would kind of comfort and conceal what had happened in the past, that you would try and smooth these rough edges. And I wanted to try and hold us to account, hold myself to account, really, because this was an extraordinary time, and you had to ask yourself whether you did enough. And, you know, I think we're all still asking that question. So the manner of the writing, it's not friendly, it's jarring, it's angry, it's a little bit sweary. I never swear, I never get, I try to be kind of kind and helpful and patient with my colleagues, with the people I look after in the hospital. But there is a lot of frustration in that, and it is because it is literally an untangling of all the anger and everything that one probably suppressed during the day. And I've never really written, obviously I kept a diary when I was very young, but I've never written a diary like this, an account. And I think it really wasn't meant initially for anyone else to read. It was meant for myself to reflect upon, and I hoped it would be from a place of wisdom. And it's actually...
So then, when you went back and read it and it was going to be turned into a book, did you then think, because often when we write from emotion, I did it when I was injured and I wrote reams, and then I went back and thought, oh God, I never want anyone else to see this. Did you go back and think, gosh, I'm not sure this can go to print, I don't know if I want everyone to read this?
Oh, absolutely. I think it was towards the end of writing the account. I'd actually got COVID, and the reason I'd got COVID was due to not being given appropriate PPE while looking after COVID-positive patients. There was a nurse I'd worked with who'd got COVID in the same situation, who'd died a few weeks after. And I actually thought maybe this is something that, that could be shared and maybe even should be shared. And having made that decision that I wanted to share what was the unvarnished truth, I just thought I should put it out exactly as it was written, because even though it is difficult to read, and in some ways it's extraordinary when you look back and see, you know, the conditions we were dealing with, the constantly changing rules, the lack of protection, the lack of basic liberties, really, in some ways for, you know, the healthcare staff, the lack of recognition of how much of danger we were from our patients. All of that, I felt it was important to keep. So it was difficult looking back on it. I wondered how it would even reflect on me professionally, because certainly in the UK, doctors who write about our patients are considered you know, power-hungry egotists, and why are you doing that, and why do you want that attention? And so it wasn't for that, but I thought at the same time someone needs to say something about this, and most of my colleagues are frankly too busy working to write books and to share this. But this is at least one thing I could contribute, because I should point out
you're also an incredibly busy woman. Professor Saad Shafqat, you also continued working through the pandemic, not in the acute wards directly, but as a neurologist when people needed your care. What was your experience of working in Pakistan during the pandemic?
So it was obviously a very unexpected time, and what struck me was how people came together. And as Roopa is saying, that there was all of a sudden a lot of burden that you just, it wasn't even, I mean, so you had to work a lot, you had to work extra shifts, you had to reorganize the way you deliver care, and it was just very impressive how people, you know, rose to the occasion. There is obviously fatigue sets in, but fatigue set in very late, and I was just really, I mean, stamina appeared out of nowhere. People had energy that we didn't think we had, and so I think in the national of that, you know, this is a crisis we have to face together. And then certainly, as Faisal is mentioning, the direction from the government also helped a lot. But what I'll be left with, I think, years from now, is just the way people came together at this, you know, time of a dire crisis.
Dr. Sultan, unlike other countries, Pakistan closed its borders pretty swiftly. And there was often an argument between healthcare and the economy. Was that hard to make that decision, or was it pretty easy and it was unequivocal for you?
It wasn't easy, simply because there was a plethora of opinion, even within the profession. Now, global best practices in the past had actually shown that closing of borders, unless done completely, and totally and for an extended period of time are unlikely to actually stem the pandemic. Because once it's out and it's a fairly infectious condition, then shutting off the border is actually closing the door once the barn when the horse is gone already. So it had to be, again, sensible and calibrated. All you could do by shutting down travel within, or travel from outside, was to delay the introduction of large numbers, because eventually a large density country, once it has a critical mass of cases, will generate its own pandemic. And shutting off the borders really wouldn't help. So there's always this pro and con debate and heated debates even within our system, and a lot of adversarial positions. So some of my colleagues in the NCOC and other people from the government constantly tease me about it, that you have a particular point of view on this, which I will not tell exactly what it is. So no, I was just kidding. It is what I just said, which is that you have to look at it sensibly, because in a global pandemic, if people think that just shutting off flights and travel is the only thing, or is a major impact onto stemming the pandemic, then it has to be done at a time when it is truly containable, and it is not already out already. So one had to see, okay, what is it that we are stopping? What is the objective of raising the sort of bar into entry? When you introduce tests, what exactly are they checking? What is the window in which they are effective? How stringent do you make those checks? In fact, there's a little trade-off. You can actually make it so hard as to make it unrealistic, unusable. On the other hand, you could make it so easy as to make it meaningless. So you had to use the slider and actually move it too, depending on what stage and situation the pandemic was on. You had a new variant in X, Y, and Z place, and so you said, okay, fine, we'll restrict travel from there. But then the world's a very connected place. They're not coming directly from there, and so people always end up coming from some other place. So countries that travel well, in other words, that have citizens that go all over the world, would find it always very difficult to use the border control as a mechanism. The only time you can do it is if you are a smaller island out somewhere where not too many people go, and the volume of traffic is low. So this was the dilemma and the challenge that existed throughout. There's a whole lot of detail that one could go into, but you've got only an hour here.
I could do an hour with each of you, that's for sure. Dr. Farooki, again, back to your book and your life experience as it was at the time, the very sad passing of your sister, and the parallel of experiencing your own personal grief and trauma and the bereavement process there. And then, of course, as all doctors do and nurses do throughout the world, experience the grief and trauma of losing patients and witnessing their demise, whether that, and you put it so well in the book repeatedly, for some it was swift, for some it was long and hard. And your strength, of course, is extraordinary, and I won't go into talking about that, but more about how did you experience those parallels as a human being, a sister, and as a doctor working in a pandemic, and how did you reconcile them?
I think my bereavement, I think losing my sister, I think it changed something about how I approached the pandemic, because to be honest, she passed away just a few weeks before the 0 day, the day before lockdown, which is when the book starts. And I was just in a kind of a fog while the pandemic was happening. I was listening to the whispers and the rumors, and I was just literally kind of marching into work every day and just doing my job and not really letting it affect me too much. I really wasn't paying attention too much to what was happening in the world, because I was dealing with my own personal grief. And the prologue to the book was written just a couple of weeks before the lockdown started, because that was me trying to unwind and make some sense of what had happened, of this tragedy, of this sort of young, vibrant woman, this lawyer, this mother, and and the unfairness of it all. And then very quickly, actually, working the front line in the pandemic, looking after patients day after day who were getting ill and passing away and losing their lives in different ways due to the pandemic, sometimes because of COVID, sometimes because they hadn't got to see their doctor in time and a heart attack had been missed, and then they were in multi-organ failure by the time they presented to the hospital. I realized that my individual grief was just a drop in the ocean of what was happening. It was just being subsumed by this flood of collective grief and bereavement. And I realized what had started as an individual story, my story, her story, that I was trying to tell, that I was trying to save for us, because I was afraid that the moment when I lost that grief and that sense of loss, that I would actually lose her. I think for some of us, grief is just this long shadow cast by love, and you fear that when you lose that, you lose the person who started it. And I realized in my working during the pandemic, and I guess in the writing of this book, that I was not just writing it for me. I was trying to kind of collate in some way this collective experience, this sadness that we were all feeling. It wasn't just my sister, it was everyone's sister, daughter, mother, child, parent, that we were all fearful for, and that we were all doing our very best to look after. We really, I think, myself and all the clinicians here, I think we really tried to treat every patient as though they were part of our family, because we knew in our hearts that it was a member of our family who was going to be looked after by someone like us.
The moments as well in your descriptions of, wanting to be the tooth fairy, or, wanting to help people, and there was the woman where you suddenly saw EOL, end of life palliative care, and the tenderness with which you write about that is, it's noticeable. And I think sometimes we forget that when we see the medical world and it's so sanitized and businesslike, or if you've ever experienced going to a hospital and an illness, that can be lost. And we forget that these are also human beings going through their own lives. And that leads me to my next question about your writing and what you've put down on paper, which is there is a chapter early on which almost perfectly surmises all your experiences in one go, but in particular you write very intricately and intensely about what doctors do, and it's a list of things you're doing and people you're helping, and it's a vision of what doctors do that we don't often get, and you'll see when you read the book that we only experience doctors of what it means to us. We're not thinking about what you're having to do, whether that's a stitch or decide how many milligrams to give, or listening out for the right kind of cough or heartbeat, or how the blood is moving through our body. And I really loved that about how you wrote that. And it was obviously, again, you just processing and putting down, today I did this, 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 and this. And you also make a point later in the book, which is that we rarely see people from those different perspectives. And you will all know this, all three of you. I certainly know it as a journalist. What I do at work, my family don't get to hear about in great... I mean, I was saying to you earlier, I was at Bin Laden's compound within hours of Bin Laden being found. I don't think my mother, brother, and sister have ever asked me about what that was like. It was just another story that I did, and let's get on with life and make dinner. And then you're also a mother and caring for your children, and then homeschooling and lockdown. So sorry, I've talked enough with my questions because I did enjoy the book. So tell us about giving everyone that 360 perspective.
I think that, I was just very aware that nobody, it was quite lonely in some ways working in the hospital, because obviously myself and my colleagues were all going through these things, and we didn't really want to we didn't talk about what it was like because we knew what it was like. But the truth was that you got home at the end of the day and no one knew what you'd been through, and you didn't want to unburden yourself and your family. You couldn't, for the sake of comforting yourself in some way, know everything that you'd been doing. It's too hard, isn't it, to talk about the people you've lost. Sometimes they can tell that it's been a particularly hard day, but you just kind of hold it to yourself. And equally, people in medicine, they don't want to know about my the mundanity of your daily domestic, life, of me going home and stressing about, the homeschooling and whether I've, put enough fresh fruit on the table, whether I've managed to get clean clothes for school the next day, whether I've done the Monday night knit check. So you have this kind of complex of life where you're kind of dealing with the absolute mundane to the absolute extraordinary. And I was aware, I guess we all were. And I'm also a literature lecturer, so I was looking after my students and kind of being aware of what they were going through when they were trying to do this kind of distance learning, and they were very much doubting the importance of their work as well. I think everyone who was, one of my colleagues said that everyone who's not working in medicine right now feels pretty useless. And I said, imagine how it feels when you are working in medicine. So I think we were flying all these different kites. We're just aware that, you know, these lives were kind of intersecting and feeling very different. So it was a way of, I guess, of trying to share some of those experiences.
So Dr. Sultan, I'm going to take this opportunity to ask you about that, because you found yourself in the extraordinary position of leading a nation's response to a pandemic, but, you know, how many people ask you about how you're feeling or what you're going through or what was going on behind the scenes?
So for me personally, it was a very, very strange experience, to say the least. So I am normally a clinical doctor. I see patients, an administrator as well, perhaps, but a clinician with direct access to patients and an infectious disease physician. And so quite paradoxically, literally almost to the day today, I found myself switching roles. And to make these large collective decisions, which are just impossible to be such that they would be acceptable or be pleasing to everyone, especially to my own tribe, to my own set of people. So, you know, physicians that were out in the fields, facing the disease, facing it head-on, face-to-face, and to ensure that the decision-making that was being done catered to their safety, to their needs, that the guidelines we were putting out were rational and reasonable. And if I said you're going to be using an N95 mask in this, that, or other situation, that not only was it science-based, it was good enough to protect everyone, and that we had enough of what I was putting out as being required. So this juggling of 10 balls at one time was the real challenge. And there was really literally no one you could speak to. And I was actually rooted out of my home. So my wife used to joke that everybody else's family has actually come down. So this so-called lockdown, everybody has more time. Whatever else the other challenges were, people had more family time. And us in particular, our family was torn asunder. I was sitting in another town, and so with really much reduced ability to converse and communicate. So I had some support structure there, but so that was the other challenge, that if you were making collective decisions, they could not be fine enough for everyone, but yet they could not be blunt enough such as to not cater to outliers in a reasonable way. So all across, from treatment, prevention stuff, when it came to vaccines, and so on.
Did you, I mean, I guess I can, you said this, Dr. Farooki, as well. Did you feel alone at times? Was it hard?
By nature, I don't feel alone. But yes, it was lonely in that sense, that at the end of the day, you were going to, and you know, we've had these, in the NCOC, that somebody would say, okay, fine, make the call. Because in the end, you know, people had opinions this way, that way. In the end, okay, what does the literature say? What does the data say? And based on that, make a call. And so you had to. And so that way it does get a little bit lonely.
Saad, how was it for you, the intensity of the whole situation?
So, you know, I mean, the book that I've written, we've talked about what's happening at the bedside in the process of actually directly delivering care. But there is a backstory to that. And the backstory is that, you know, the profession is like any other. I mean, it's a community of humans which has its own drama, it has its own pathos, its own, you know, egos, resentments, passions, and all of that. And so I've tried to capture that in my book. It does get intense. I mean, I work at a university hospital where delivering excellent clinical care is taken for granted. But then there's also this other side to it that nobody gets to see, which is what you were also alluding to, which is the reality of, you know, doctors being. And so there's, so it gets intense, absolutely. And I think the intensity is something that different people handle in different ways. Some people crack, some people just tough it out. What I found is that if, as a doctor, you have some other interest as well. you have some other passion or some other pursuit, then it's like having an extra room that you can escape into. Once the heat gets too much in one room, then you always have this other, sort of a safety valve, and that helps a lot. And I think that helped a lot. That helped a lot with people during the pandemic as well, because it was just it's like a tidal wave of workload that came our way, and you had to deal with it somehow.
And let's talk more about your book, Rivals, sexual politics, leadership conflicts behind the scenes. Of course, you'd already written it, and tell us a bit about the book, and tell us how much you saw that play out as well, even during a pandemic.
So, right. My book, in a nutshell, without giving too much away, is, so it's a university hospital where two people who are very accomplished surgeons, one is a trauma surgeon, the other is an ophthalmologist, lady trauma surgeon, a male ophthalmologist, and they compete for the leadership of the surgery department. And the way it plays out is I've seen, and you write what you know, so the raw material to come from your own experiences. So there is a little bit of playing the gender card, more by one gender than the other. I will not tell you which. And then just the way it plays out is the way I've seen things play out in real life. Yes, you're right. I wrote it before the pandemic. In fact, I didn't even intend for it to be a book about sexual politics. I just wanted it to reflect the faculty politics, what I saw at my institution. And when I started writing it, the thing about writing fiction is that you're making it all up, so it's make-believe, and you have the freedom to go in any direction that you want. So I wrote the first chapter, which was focusing on this trauma surgeon, this woman, and her ambitions, her passions, her desires, her dreams, and her regular work day. And then it just meandered into these different directions. And if I would hit a block during the plot, during developing the story, and I would find a tangent, then it turned out the tangent opened the door into another new universe. And so that's how the story ended up being about sexual politics and a little bit of Me Too, hashtag Me Too, I guess. Yeah. During the pandemic, what I've seen is, the reality remained the same. It's not going to change. People are going to be people. So egos, for example, there were, in our hospital, we had to open up new wards, we had to add new beds, we had to add, people in the, in services, and then who was going to be doing that? There was a competition, who was going to be in the lead, and who's going to have, who's going to be more visible as the person who took care of the hospital during the pandemic. So there was all of, there is all of that. I think in a way it also helps, because if you are competing with each other, you end up doing better work. For better or worse, that's also the reality.
I'm going to move swiftly on now, because we have about 10 minutes left for our conversation. Then I want to give you guys a chance to ask your own questions as well. So, Dr. Sultan, I want to ask you about what you've learnt from this experience, and presumably you built on, of course, your own learning, of course, through working in the AIDS sector and infectious diseases previously. But what have you learnt that you will take forwards from this and that you want to share with people?
I think some bit that I knew already to some extent was the importance of great communication. And I think if there's one thing that came out of this was that beyond the science, beyond anything else, the ability to connect across the system with people at various stages of their and various roles that they have, to be able to communicate well would be a very, very important skill to have. I think if there's one thing that stands out amongst myriad, I think these 2 years have been just teaching and learning of just another kind for me, and I feel really privileged to have had the opportunity. But I think that if I was to single out one thing, it would be great comms, great communication.
And of course, you have now joined Gavi. For me, I returned to work during the pandemic, actually, after my injury. And one of the things that I found I really struggled with was the vaccine inequity. Fantastic. Saad and I, we were talking, and I'll come to that. In fact, actually, Saad, let me come to you first, because you're very positive about the fact that we developed a vaccine so quickly, right? And then we'll come to vaccine inequity.
I think it's been absolutely fantastic. Look at what happened. I mean, if you look at the great successes of medical science, antibiotics, the polio vaccine, cancer chemotherapy, MRI imaging, CT imaging, I would put this COVID vaccine development up there, because you had this pandemic that came out of nowhere, that spread like wildfire, literally. And then we had a vaccine within a matter of months, maximum a year. And a new technology that had been languishing, which is this RNA vaccine technology, that nobody had really thought would end up doing much. It was exploited, and it ended up giving us fabulous product, and it saved us. It saved the human race. So it's, I think I'm floored by the success. And I think part of it is, of course, scientific development, but what Faisal mentioned about communications, I think instantaneous communications in the modern era, that was also key, because people were able to collaborate and share results and so forth. And I mean, science is driven a lot by collaborative communication. And so that also played a big role. And the other part of your question is, of course, the inequity. I guess Faisal is better able to handle that. But in terms of the scientific achievement, this is up there.
And as you said, it saved humans, but it didn't save everyone. And it's still not saving everyone because of vaccine inequity. The Global Alliance for Vaccine Equity, as Gavi is an acronym for. I've interviewed many people in Africa and Asia who are incredibly frustrated. I certainly felt slightly uncomfortable, and yet I had to, because I have family members who are immunosuppressed, and my mother is elderly. So I went and got my third booster, but I felt incredibly guilty because some people in the world haven't even had their first yet. Dr. Sultan?
So this exposed a bunch of things which are inherent to us as humans. So it was great. The human race was able to come out with a vaccine or a set of vaccines. In fact, the most interesting bit was it wasn't one. It was a bunch of different technologies that came to fore, and so you had options. But the ability to scale this, and to scale this very quickly to be able to serve the entire world, was obviously limited. And so immediately you saw what is an inherent human trait, which is to first look at self-interest. And so you had countries, and so people would say, okay, why haven't you locked in orders? I said, well, look, there are countries that have locked in orders for 5x of their population. So if they have 100 people, if they've locked orders for 500 people, and yet can't get access to the vaccine. I don't want to name the country, but there was such a country. And so here we were, where everybody then immediately locked on to their own stash, if you will. We had next door India, who were supposed to be able to provide, be the pharmacy to the world, as their prime minister said. But coincidentally and paradoxically, just at the time that they were going to become the pharmacy to the world vis-a-vis vaccines, their own second wave just went through the roof. And so understandably, they said, well, we're going to take care of our own first. So the one thing that became very clear is that in a pandemic, it'll be crucially important to have distributed centers of production. You can have the technology come out to observe. Many countries were at like 1 or 2% of their population being vaccinated.
Yeah, we're still only just getting there. Roopa, at what point did you feel that the introduction of vaccine in the UK had kicked in, and did you witness that change through your practice?
Yeah, certainly. I remember being able to get I thought it extraordinary that just a few days after the first person in the UK got the vaccine in my hospital, we were able to get it, the first one, a couple of weeks later. So that was in December 2020. But the effect wasn't really seen for a few months, because I was redeployed to the COVID wards. I was on a pediatric rotation at the time, and everyone on non-urgent specialties. At that point, we had another huge surge in the UK over January and February and March. And so I was redeployed to the aerosol generating procedures wards, and managing purely COVID patients on unsafe rota, actually, which they later found out, because we all had to go all hands to the deck, and were looking after very unwell people as a result of Christmas mixing, to be honest. And it was heartbreaking. I remember one Friday morning when we lost 4 patients, one after another, in a row. So that's 4 sets of families we had to tell that story to. there was nothing that could be done. They hadn't yet got the vaccine rolled out to everyone. They hadn't got their first jab. They had thought, as per our government, that things were calming down and that they could take their gran or their mother out for a treat. That was how they put it. And that was that, or they would visit them for a treat. This is what grandchildren were telling me. And then that was how their grandmother and then their grandfather ended up coming to a hospital and passing away. It was really, really sad. So in those few months, the first few months after the vaccine, I didn't see the effects of it. But then later on, I certainly see the effects of it. I'm currently on a ward which is the COVID positive ward in my hospital, simply because of the relaxing of restrictions in the UK meant that it's very widespread in the community. So one person came into a bay with it, and then the whole ward lit up blue with COVID. But they're all actually incidentally have COVID alongside the other reasons they came into hospital. On the acute take, so in A&E, the only patients I've actually been admitting because of COVID, just because of COVID, are the young men and women in their 20s and 30s, and some in their early 40s, who have just refused the vaccine. And they're the ones who are coming in, who need oxygen, who need their steroid, their dexamethasone, who need to be looked up and prepped up for trials and the antibodies and everything else, because they've refused it. Older people, most people in their 40s plus, realise that they're vulnerable and have been taking it up. So I've definitely seen a difference in that it is those who've refused the vaccine, more or less, who are the ones who are being admitted because of their COVID. But I had, for example, a 95-year-old lady on my ward who came in with something completely different, who was really surprised to find out she had COVID, and she was almost asymptomatic from it.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to stop asking the questions and hand over to... Oh, great, hands up already. And when you get the mic, can we bring it to that lady there with the pink kameez and the white dupatta right here in parallel with the camera? Then I saw a hand there with the red top. And then we have two people, one there, one there. So the lady first, please. If you say your name, where you're from, and then tell us who you're addressing your question to. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, I'm Amber, and I think I'm going to give Mr. Faisal another lonely moment. My question to you is, where do we go from here? How important is it for us to wear masks? Because when we look around, then either we've built our immunity up, or maybe we've not. So where do we go from here?
So directly into the art of soothsaying and turning into a Najumi here. Where do we go from here? I think that from as much information as one can gather about this sort of thing from the past, extrapolations from our present experiences, it seems like the bulk of the large, dangerous waves have passed through. That does not mean that a new variant cannot and will not arise. It can. But generally speaking, as things stand today, and as you perhaps have noticed, there are surges in Europe right now already. So I think that we will have wavelets. Probably they will not have as much mortality associated with them as we saw with previous variants. And so therefore, in tight, closed spaces, and if we have people from outside our normal social network and sitting very close, then it'd be useful to wear a mask. And this may stay for a few weeks to a few months. This is the best I can tell you.
Gentleman with the red top, and then can we move the mics to the two people either side, please?
Thank you. I'm Dr. Amir Jafri from the Center of Biomedical Ethics and Culture, SIUT in Karachi. Enjoyed the session thoroughly. Questions for Dr. Faisal and Saad. Dr. Faisal, you've had a robust response based on, as you said yourself, the data that you were able to generate and utilize properly. Now, data is everywhere. Big data, the biggest form of big data is right now with you. We have all of us over here and millions of, outside are on it. Our CNICs, our health data, our banking data, everything's on it. Are there any safeguards to protect that data? Because we've seen the WhatsApp lists of people's names, NICs and addresses and COVID positivity or negativity floating around. So what are the safeguards? That is one thing. Second thing is, now that we are hopefully beyond COVID, you've developed a very good public health process, and you're putting this into the CDC, hopefully. How do you see this impacting on the other significant non-COVID related public health chronic issues that we are facing and suffering from? So that was for you. Saad,
Thank you.
You wrote the book.
Sorry, sir. Thank you. Let's answer that question.
So, very quickly. So, shall I answer that, or should I? So, look, data is gold when used, and is mud when not used. And so you have to really have a balance between keeping it usable and yet not making it such that it breaches people's privacies and other risks that it creates for individuals. So right now, what we did, at least, and I'm going to specifically speak about testing data and about vaccine data, we directly worked with NADRA, who actually have a pretty robust, nothing is ever fail-safe, you know that, but have a pretty robust system of ensuring their data. I'll tell you the extent to which they're, I should use the words, careful, or, I don't want to use the word skittish or jittery, but careful about it, is that even in my own present official position, the hoops that I have to go through to just look at analysis of the primary data is pretty tedious. And so I think the safeguards are there. But I think more need to be structured and built in. The second one, you talked about going into the new sort of the CDC and the new NIH. I think that's been done already. And we do feel and hope that everything that got learned here will get transposed and transitioned to the new entities to be able to make good decisions later on, institutionalized and not just reactive.
Thank you.
Hello.
Yes, it's me, Muhammad Usman, and I'm a student of public administration. I have a very bitter question to you, Mr. Faisal, that don't you think in Pakistan, specifically in Pakistan's health system, COVID-19 patients have been a priority in the last couple of years, but all other patients suffering from different diseases like heart, liver, and cancer, they have been quite ignored. Don't you think so?
Thank you. I mean, that I would say is a global issue, so I might ask both Roopa and Dr. Sultan to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I agree. It's something that I actually mention and talk about a lot in my book, how we felt we were letting go of other patients, how I've actually talked about this in the UK on the waiting list crisis, and how everyone who was waiting for these elective procedures had surgeries cancelled, how quality of life has declined, how waiting lists for example, operations for cancer even are actually going over the 12-month limit. In my book, I talk about a lady who, because of the COVID pandemic, didn't get access to her GP. She had just some very non-specific symptoms of diarrhea and sweats and so on. And by the time she finally came into I&E a week later after her initial symptoms, we found out that she probably had a heart attack. She'd had her heart in irregular rhythm for days. She was no longer sufficiently supplying blood to her main organs, kidneys and liver, and she was arrived to us in multi-organ failure simply because she didn't have access to her GP, who would have felt her pulse, seen the irregular rhythm, got an ECG and got her into hospital. So a week before, she was shopping with her husband and she came to us dying. And so these were the patients that I talk a lot about, the patients who were missed out because of COVID, patients who were waiting for lung transplants and liver transplants, which weren't done simply because they never had those initial screening appointments because everything was being closed down. There's no good way around it. We were all, redeployed into acute medicine, and those who had needs which were urgent but not acute did fall by the wayside, certainly in my trust, in my hospital, and it's something that we're still trying to deal with now.
You know what what we also saw was that yes, the priority was different from the medical professional side, but also from the patient side, because during the first pandemic wave, and this was a universal phenomenon, we saw the hospitals were flooded with COVID, but the other patients disappeared. Nobody was coming to the emergency room. Normally in my neurology service, we admit anything from 50, 60, 70 patients a week. We were admitting 5 or 10. And we haven't really explained that. That was a global phenomenon. I don't know what happened to those illnesses during that time, but that's the other side of it. I think COVID just overwhelmed everyone, as Roopa is saying, certainly on the delivery side, but also on the consumer side.
Dr. Sultan, I mean, certainly in the UK, I know that from the interviews I've done is that a lot of people were saying, and amongst my own family members, people wouldn't go because they didn't want to burden the hospitals, and they stayed back and kept their symptoms to themselves as well. But anyway. You can give us an overview directly to
Sure.
the question.
So look, there was an inherent trade-off between when you actually started to have restrictions, or you had high volume COVID fill-up of medical units of all kinds, or you had the very fact that accessing care was hard. So all of these things had an impact, and so therefore there was a trade-off. There was a definite impact, an inverse relationship, if you will, with some diseases. Some was real, and they're still unexplained. So for 2 years straight, influenza actually took a nosedive. 2 years, there was hardly any influenza. This is a global phenomenon, well studied, but nobody quite knows why, whether this is viral interference, use of masks, whatever. So that one. Trauma, for example, in the weeks of lockdown, ask anyone, the trauma referrals got down. But then there is the missing X, heart disease, neurology, a lot of other things that just did not present. And people are unsure whether they did not present because it went down for some numbers, or it was just simply ignored and arrived late in a more disastrous situation. When we were having this very intense and acrimonious political debate about lockdowns or not, one of the most powerful arguments I thought that were to be made for a more nuanced, more balanced set of restrictions and not blunt lockdowns was exactly this. Vaccinations, access to care, preventive care, the woman who will end up with obstructive labor who did not come in time for an antenatal checkup, and so on. Fortunately, to answer your question interestingly, it is exactly during this time that we were able to get polio to zero. So that also is reflective of the fact that there is enough bandwidth in the system that if managed right, you can serve at least a few important priorities.
And have to be made. We've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask the lady at the back to ask the question, and then this gentleman who held his hand up right at the beginning, please. Thank you.
Okay, I'm a physician, so it's very interesting to see all of you sitting there. My question is for Roopa. Did you ever had to think on your feet, think out of the box while treating your patients? Because one of my colleagues, she couldn't get hand on the PPM, and she took the parachute material from the parachute, and she had the tailor stitch the PPM in Pakistan, in Rawalpindi. So this is something amazing that you have done. Did you ever had to think on your feet when you were not being helped by the technology and NHS and everything? Thank you.
I think, Roopa, is that to you?
I'm sorry, I didn't absolutely hear the question. Was it about thinking?
I think from what I could hear, I think it was improvising and someone using parachute material to make a mask. Is that right? Oh, the whole PPE. And of course, you in your book point out the limitations on PPE. You turned up in just leggings and a top, right? Expecting to get PPE and didn't, and had to work in
No,
those
I mean,
clothes.
I think if I had done what your friend had done and actually improvised, it would have been a very sensible thing to have done. But to be honest, there was a huge limit to any materials in our hospital, and all the PPE was swept off my ward and all the other wards to go to the respiratory ward and to the ITU, and we were looking after COVID-positive patients without anything. I actually can pinpoint exactly when I got COVID, which is when I was looking after a COVID-positive patient who had, he'd had 2 negative tests, but he was quite obviously COVID positive from his CT. But because the tests were negative, he was kept in a bay. And when he was deteriorating and aspirating and desaturating, I went in to stabilize him, and he aspirated and vomited all over me and a couple of my colleagues. And 8 days later is when I tested positive. And we had no PPE. We had the regular masks. I actually sat in on a board meeting in management because I'm on the management and leadership program in my hospital. So I sat with our CEO and listened to the evidence about how our regular masks weren't going to be of any use to us in protecting us, and how we needed the FFPs. And they made a decision that they just couldn't provide sufficient for everyone, so they wouldn't provide them at all. And so that was why we were so exposed. So if I had, we weren't allowed to. I had colleagues who'd actually got families send materials over from China, and they weren't allowed to use them in the hospital. So we couldn't. We actually had to just use what we had, and it was not sufficient. But I wish we had been able to improvise. I think it would have made a little bit of a difference.
Yeah, but you weren't allowed. Okay, one final question. We have 2 minutes left. I also need to surmise. So quick question, quick answer, please.
My name is Omar. My question is to Dr. Faisal and Mr. Saad. Like we've you've discussed, the panel has discussed that, you know, the world was facing this challenge and it was a new thing altogether. My question is that for developing countries like Pakistan or India, what would be the way forward where you could align academia at the same time? And, you know, in Pakistan, we've seen that, you know, we've faced issues with YDA, you know, in different provinces. Is it a right time to look into this, to look at the compensation also, and also to align the academic side or the curriculum side to be more ready in the future to face such challenges?
Me first? Yeah. So look, the first part, of course, the pandemic preparedness as far as the central nerve center is concerned, we've actually already done it through law. There's a new CDC which is being populated with people, etc. So all that is there as well. But the second thing that you refer to is even more important, better governance. And I think our institutions need to be better governed. And one of the things that we've tried to do is this famous MTI Act, the Medical Teaching Institutes Act, to allow better governance, one-line budgets, flexibility on decision-making to private sector boards instead of running to the secretariat for every little thing. So this improved governance of large institutions as well as the primary and secondary care network will actually lead to that robustness that you are referring to. Thanks.
Yeah, so my take on this is that you're right, it is an opportunity, and it is a time when people are coming together and people are willing to think about it. What I'm seeing missing in all of this is the coordination between the private and the public sector. And that is where I think, I mean, from the private sector point of view, we are handling a lot of the nation's healthcare burden. I think surveys repeatedly show that, this is the majority, and as Faisal is saying now, it's 70%. So I would just like to see more engagement from the center and from our government of the private sector.
Thanks, everyone. We're going to wrap up, but don't all suddenly get up because I have a few things I want to say. I intended to open the session with a moment's silence in respect of all the people and loved ones we've all probably lost or know of. So you go off and perhaps do that privately if we can all take a moment to reflect on the people who have lost, but also to say thank you to our panelists and thank you to all doctors, nurses, the cleaners who turned up for work on the front line, the people who went out of their houses and worked hard, sometimes without the protective equipment that they needed to take care of us, to make sure that we are all here today and we are safe and well. So actually I'm going to give you a standing ovation, so thank you very much.